Hello, everyone. Thanks for listening to Wake Up, Look Up, a podcast where we connect events happening in real time to the gospel of Jesus Christ. I'm Zach Wyrock, and in today's episode, we're asking the question, is grief good for us? This is prompted by an article I read this week called Why We Are Getting Worse at Grieving. Now, the article was looking at social media and the fact that we know more about what's going on in the world than we ever have before, which means almost every day, we're hearing about yet another sad story, a natural disaster, a terrorist attack, some kind of awful, horrific thing that produces in us grief, feeling of sadness, empathy for those who are suffering, or at least it used to. The author talked about how we're all living in this state of shallow grief, kind of all the time. We don't really know the people involved, and we don't really know if we can do anything about it, but we're kind of sad because we know bad stuff is happening. It's almost like our knowledge of what's going on in the world supersedes our capacity. We know that. We can't aim at it, so we're just kind of sad and grieving all the time. But the unfortunate consequence of knowing about all that's going on in the world is that it desensitizes us to grief in two ways. One is we learn to suppress that shallow grief. So we learn how to shove down or swallow the grief we're feeling, because after all, we can't do anything about hurricane victims. We can't do anything about people in that far off country where that bad thing happened. But it also can lead to a desensitized to the grieving around us. So the more comfortable I get with ignoring and moving through grief, maybe the less helpful I am when someone actually close to me, someone who I could help, someone who I could be there for, is in fact grieving. I'll just say two things about this by way of kind of bringing the Bible to bear on it. One is, this is another way I worry that social media isn't helping us. We know too much, and sometimes knowing too much about the world leads to knowing too little about our world. The more time I'm in my phone, the less aware I am of what's going on around me. So we're becoming good at kind of corporate grief and really bad at personal grief. Because personal grief, and this is the second thing, is something the Bible calls us to pretty regularly. I mean, Ecclesiastes 3 tells us there's a time to mourn. There's a time to grieve. That is God sanctioning grief. If you read through the Psalter, the book of Psalms, you would find a great many of them are dealing with difficulty and pain. To grieve isn't to be less than human or less than worshipful. Actually, to not grieve is to be less than human and less than worshipful, because part of grief is driving us to God. Part of it is driving us to ask God for the world to be made new, to want change, renewal. These are things that God brings. Jesus did this, by the way, in John 11, when his friend Lazarus dies. When Jesus knows even he's getting ready to raise Lazarus from the dead, I mean, he knows he's going to do that, he still weeps. Because death is bad. It's hard. Grief is a natural response. Listen, in Galatians 6, when we're told to bear one another's burdens, it doesn't mean liking a post or sharing it on Facebook or Twitter. What it means is to actually sit with someone who's crying and cry, to actually join them in their pain, to join them in their discomfort, to bring a meal, to clean their house, to do something practical and loving and compassionate because their grief matters to you. They matter to you. Listen, are you any good at grieving with those around you? Do you even know who's struggling around you? I mean, brothers and sisters listening to this podcast, listen, we have to be able to turn off technology enough to see people around us who is hurting. I mean, I think about my own church, where we start almost every service with, here's someone who's lost a family member. And I wonder how many of us, myself included, just blow by that. It's just yet another data point in our world of grief. But it is the data point That's a person we can actually help, a person we can actually care for. Grief with those around us matters. Also because the Bible teaches us while grief is a natural and normal response to death and decay, it is always done because of Jesus with hope on the horizon. In 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul says we should grieve, but we should grieve in a particular way, knowing that Christ is making all things new. Listen, when you're the one experiencing the grief, that feels a million miles away, which is why I need you to sit with me in that moment and remind me, when appropriate, after we've cried together, that Jesus is at work, which you can't do for me and I can't do for you if we're not paying attention and if we are on our phones. Is grief good for us? Not the social media kind, not the low-level resting hum of knowing that the world is broken, but a deep, personal, relational, proximity-driven, ministry-driven, presence-driven kind of grief is essential for what God is calling us to as a church. Are you any good at handling grief? I know I need to get better. Let's do it for the glory of God and for the good of each other. Hey, thanks so much for watching this episode of Wake Up, Look Up. While you're here, take a minute to like and subscribe. It really helps us get the word out. Don't hesitate to leave a review wherever you might find this podcast on an audio level and help spread the word. And hey, while you're here, check out all the other content we have at Christ Community Chapel on YouTube. Some of those videos are popping up on the screen now. Click on one.